There we go. Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Ross Bayton joining us today. He is going to talk about the origins of color in plants. He is currently director of the Heronswood Garden. He is London-born, as you will know the minute he opens his mouth, and got his PhD at the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew and studied the classification of tropical palms, but save those questions for the end since he'll be talking to us about color. He's authored many books. The one I had heard about because it was in the popular media was The Gardener's Botanical, an encyclopedia of Latin plant names. The New York Times gave it a great write-up. He's also written several other books, one on plant families, another on new trees. And he is editor of a gardening periodical, the BBC's Gardener's World magazine. And is serving as the director of the Heronswood Gardens, which is in Kingston, Washington, and is developing his own 5-acre garden in nearby Bremerton. He is certainly an experienced gardener, plants person, botanist, and taxonomist, and is very enthusiastic. So I think we're going to have a wonderful talk tonight. As usual, please hold your questions to the end or put them in the chat, or you can ask them verbally at the end, but we want to roll right along. So we'll go ahead and get started. In terms of the Four Seasons Garden Club news, I just wanted to thank Barclay for making the arrangements, for Jim Dronenberg for reaching out to Dr. Bayton, and to let y'all know that we are planning the traditional gift exchange in December, and I will send out an email about that after this meeting. Let's go for it, Ross. Thank you.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I was lucky enough to meet one of your colleagues when I was giving a lecture over in North Carolina, and that was kind of the beginning of this. Heronswood is exciting garden with lots of different plants, and you'll see a few of them on while I'm talking today. But really, I want to delve into some of the science of plants, and particularly the science of color. So why don't we get started? And a lot of what is in my lecture here began when I was working on a book. This is the book here. It's called RHS Color Companion. As you can tell from the spelling of the word color, it was never released here in the United States and only back home in the UK. But I really enjoyed making it. It really made me ask some questions about some of my assumptions about color, and kind of really tested my knowledge about why plants have color, how color is created in plants, and why they have color. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. But the first thing I thought I always like to mention in this talk is when we talk about color in plants, the first thing that people think of is flowers. And indeed, my opening slide there was full of pictures of colorful flowers. But color is not just in flowers. Color is in all sorts of places in plants. So the 4 pictures you see here are all pictures showing different species of maple. And you can see that there is color in the flowers. Top left there, you can see the little red flowers of this Japanese maple. You can see color in the spring foliage and in the fall foliage. You can see color in the bark and in the colorful stems. And you can also see color in the fruits of the maple. So when we're talking about color in plants, I'm not just talking about blooms. I might also be talking about leaves, full color, colorful stems, all the different parts of the plant that might have color. Now, one thing I won't be talking about, but is worth considering too, when you're thinking about color in the garden, it's worth also considering the color of your hard landscaping. This is in my garden at home, and you can see that there's some very colorful plants there, but you can also see that the color of the fence and the color of the paving do really make a difference to the overall display that you get with color. So when you are designing a border and you're thinking about what color scheme to use, it's worth keeping in mind things like what's the color of your house, what's the color of your fence or your wall or your barrier, what's the color of your paving, your deck. The other physical things in the landscape do have an impact on the general display that you create. But of course, I'm talking about color in plants, so I'm not going to go back to paint colors, etc. But I just felt it was worth mentioning here at the start. So I like to begin with a little bit of high school physics. And this is probably taking you a few years back to your early education. But what is color? If we're going to talk about color and why different plants are different colors, we really need to know a little bit of the background science. And light can be classified according to its wavelength. And you can see on the picture on the left, at the top, you can see a wave, and you can see that the increasing length of those waves as they stretch out. Below it, you can see different kinds of radiation and how they fit onto that different series of wavelengths. So on the left, you can see gamma rays, which have very short wavelengths. And at the far right, you can see radio waves, which have very long waves. And color is a tiny little proportion of that whole electromagnetic spectrum. So you can see here in between ultraviolet and infrared, that's the little fragment of wavelengths that we humans can see through our eyes. That's what we call the visible spectrum. So it's the colors that we see, starting with violet, which has the shortest wavelength, and going up to red, which has the longest wavelength. Now, the visible spectrum is only a tiny part of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and that includes things like infrared, X-rays, radio, lots of different kinds of radiation. And when a plant exhibits a particular color, that's not because the plant is that color, but rather because the plant reflects light of that color. So, for example, a red flower. If you look at a flower that is red, then what it's doing is it's absorbing all the different wavelengths of visible light except red. With red, it's reflecting. So the plant's flower appears red to us because it is reflecting red light back towards our eyes. And the reason why it reflects that particular color is to do with the structure of the leaf or even the pigments that are within. They respond to this they respond and reflect different wavelengths of light, which alters our perception of what we see. If an object reflects no light whatsoever, then it appears black. I.e., if an object absorbs all the light, then it will appear black. If an object reflects all of the light, then it will appear white. So white flowers are ones that reflect all of the colors of the visible spectrum back towards us, and black flowers are those that absorb all of the colors of the visible spectrum. And the color that we see is in some instances affected by our own perceptions. So obviously our own visual acuity has an effect. For example, as humans age, the way we see the color spectrum does slightly change, and our vision becomes slightly more yellow tinted as we get older, as our eyes change. So color is very much in the eye of the beholder, but this is the kind of basics of physics as to why we see color. Color is light of a particular wavelength. And from high school physics to a bit of high school biology, and this is kind of important to know, how do we see color? What is it that we are seeing, and how do we detect different colors? Well, here we have an image of the human eye. Hopefully it's not too gory for you. Light enters the eye through the pupil, and the light is reflected onto the lens, onto the retina by the lens. So behind that pupil is a lens, and the lens focuses the light onto the retina. And the retina is a series of light-sensitive cells. It covers the inside surface of the eyeball, and those cells come in two different kinds: rod cells and cone cells. Now, rod cells are not involved in color vision. Rod cells are much better at being able to detect changes in light and dark. So rod cells are really important when you're maybe outside at night and you're seeing the difference between light and shadow. That's all down to the rod cells. In humans, it's the cone cells that are all important about color. And we have three different kinds of cone cells in our eyes. We have cone cells that detect red light, cone cells that detect green light, and cone cells that detect blue light. And that gives us what is called trichromatic vision. So for humans, our vision is focused on three different parts of the color spectrum. We have trichromatic vision. And that'll be more and more important as we go and talk about color in plants, and I'll get onto that in a second. But if you are color blind, it's often inherited. It's actually several different conditions. It could be caused by faults in your cone cells in your eyes. Although Color blindness can also be caused by disconnections between the eye and the brain through the optic nerve. So there's a few things that can cause human beings to be colorblind, but our ability to detect color comes from these three different types of cone cells in the eye. Now, why do we see color? Is there a reason why we see color? If you look across the animal kingdom, you find different animals have different abilities to detect color. Birds and reptiles often have better color vision than we do. And in fact, some birds have 5 different kinds of cone cells in their eyes, which means they see the world in a much more vibrant way than we do. In fact, some birds are actually able to see ultraviolet light. So they can see the world in a kind of color palette that we can't even really imagine. Now, most land mammals are bichromatic. So that means they have 2 kinds of rod cells, and that includes our pet cats, dogs. When I was a kid, I was always told that dogs saw in black and white, and that's not strictly speaking true. Our pets see the world with color, but it's a kind of dampened down color, kind of a sepia tone, because they have 2 of the color receptors, but not the 3 that we have. If you're looking at marine mammals, they have monochromatic vision. So they only have 1 kind of color cell. And really, they have almost no color ability to detect color at all. Because when you're living in the sea and under the water, color really isn't important in your life. Of course, so why are we different from most other mammals? Most primates have trichromatic vision. So that includes humans, the great apes like orangutans, gorillas, and also a good proportion of monkeys have the ability to see 3 different colors at once. And the current theory as to why that is all because of the color of fruits. So you can see in this picture here, here's a monkey eating the fruits of a palm tree, and you can see it's choosing the orange ones. Are ripe. And if a fruit is ripe, then it will generally develop a much brighter coloration. If it's unripe, it'll be green. And the difference is also really important if you're eating those fruits, because if you eat them when they're green, they tend to be tart or bitter. But when you eat them when they're red, they tend to be sweet. And the reason that the plant does this is because it wants to make sure that its fruits are consumed only when they're ready. If the animal eats them when they're green, then the seed is not mature and ready to be dispersed, and so the fruit will be wasted. Instead, the plant wants us to eat the fruit when the seeds are ready, and so it tells us that by changing both the color and the flavor. So here you can see this monkey is using its trichromatic color ability in order to detect the difference between a ripe fruit and an unripe fruit. And it's thought that the evolution of fruits was the main thing that stimulated the development of color vision, trichromatic color vision in primates and ultimately in us humans. And today, color means so much more. Maybe back then it was all about being able to choose the right fruit. But in many primates, color vision has now allowed them to communicate with one another. You'll notice that many different species of primates are brightly colored with brightly colored fur or brightly colored skin. And they use that color of their fur or their skin to communicate with other monkeys. So here's a great example. This is a mandrill, and a mandrill is actually, it's the world's largest species of monkey. It's native in West Africa, and it has very, very colorful face. It also has some other parts of its anatomy that are very colorful too, but I didn't really feel it was appropriate to show those on the screen. When female mandrills look at this male, they see those colors and they use them to try and understand whether that male is fit. The brighter those colors, the better able the female is to tell if this male will be a good father for their offspring. So today, mammals like monkeys and apes, not only are they using color to determine what is a good thing to eat or not, but they're also using color to determine whether a mate is a good choice. And the bright colors you see on this mandrill's face give that indication to the offspring. So color vision has become a lot more important to primates than being just about the food that you eat. In human culture, color is extremely important, and we use it for a lot of different things. For a start, think about red. Red is often considered a color of danger. We see red very brightly, and so we tend to use red when we really want to make a statement. So consider a traffic signal. Red and green, red for stop, green for go. That wouldn't work if we didn't have good color vision. Lipstick too, makeup, face paint, coloring ourselves, the color of the clothes that we wear. We are sending out subliminal messages to people based on those colors. A scarlet woman, for example, we have cultural associations with that color, and red lipstick tells us something. We've taken that kind of use of color to help us understand the world, and we've used it in language too. Look at the flag, red, white, and blue. Those three colors together now are very much associated with what this country is. Ironically, of course, they're also the same three colors that are in the British flag too, and also the flags of Chile, of Russia, of a whole range of different countries. But those colors all are symbolic and have meaning beyond just the color. So we've gone beyond just being able to tell if a fruit is ripe or not. We use color in different ways. A couple of other ways that are important in which we use color. Insects. Look at this wasp here. It's black and yellow. And we all know what that means. We know that if an animal looks black and yellow like that, then there's a good chance that it's going to be able to sting us. Yellow and black is a warning to us. You can only understand that warning if you have the ability to see that yellow and black color. The steak, of course, how do you know if it's cooked? You look at the color of it. And so we humans have learned to use our sense of color to determine things like, is a fruit ripe? Is a steak cooked? Is a piece of food gone off because the color has changed? So color has become a really important method of communication amongst people. It tells you about people's moods. It tells you about whether something is safe. It tells you what you can and can't eat. Even just the fact that my face flushes red tells you a little something about my feeling or how I'm feeling at the moment. But what about plants? We're here to talk about plants. We're gardeners, and plants use color for other purposes. And perhaps the most important is pollination. When a plant produces flowers, it's not doing that to make us feel glad. It's doing that because it needs to be pollinated. It needs an insect or other creature to travel between one plant and another, carrying pollen so that the plant's flowers can be fertilized and produce seed. So for plants, color is often about reproduction. It's a way of attracting a hummingbird or a moth or a bee to come to your flower, pick up some pollen, and take it to another plant. And just check out this azalea here. You can almost see no leaves because there are so many flowers. And that color is really, really zingy. If you were a bee, you would see this plant from a very long distance away. So flowers use color as an advertisement hoarding in order to attract insects. Different animals are attracted by different colors. So this is a lobelia. It's from Chile, and it's pollinated by hummingbirds. Birds have a very strong ability to see the color red. And in fact, their range of visible color is slightly expanded in the red area compared to us. So they see more red than we see. And so this is a particularly vibrant color for a bird. And so this will attract in hummingbirds who will pollinate this lobelia. A tricky thing, though, is if you're using color to attract a bird, the bird then, when it arrives at the flower, needs to know where to put its beak. This is a heliconia. It has orangey, salmony pink colored flowers, which are attractive to hummingbirds. But the real trick is that the real flowers are these little greenish parts here. This pinky red color will attract birds from a long distance away, but when they arrive at this flower, they then need to know roughly where to put their beak. And the plant tells them that by having a counter color, in this case, green. So when the bird gets here attracted by the red, they then know to go and look at the bits that aren't red, because that's where the flowers are and that's where the nectar is. And a lot of plants use multiple different colors to tell these messages. Here's poinsettia. I'm sure everyone's grown one of these. Big red bracts around the outside, which will attract a bird from a long distance away. But when they arrive at the flowers, they're small and yellow and in the middle. That yellow coloration there is an indicator to the bird that that's where it needs to go if it wishes to receive its nectar treat. So plants use color in much more subtle ways than you might imagine. Even more subtle, here are the flowers of a horse chestnut. And can you see they have white petals, but some of them have red markings on them, and some of them have yellow markings on them. This is a message to the pollinator, usually a bee, and what it's telling them is which flower has already been pollinated and which is still awaiting pollination. So the ones that are red have already been pollinated, and the ones that are yellow have not been. And what this is doing is it's allowing the bee to only visit those flowers that still have nectar in there. Because what's the point in visiting a flower that's already been pollinated? If it's already been pollinated, then the reward in there has already been used up, and the bee is just wasting its time visiting it. So plants use color in quite subtle ways to tell they're pollinating insects or other animals which flower is worthy of visiting. And the same is true with lungwort. This is Pulmonaria. In the UK, it's quite often called soldier sailor. And the reason is that some of the flowers have a reddish color and some of them are blue. And traditionally in England, a soldier's uniform is red and a sailor's uniform is blue. This plant is doing exactly what the horse chestnut did. It's telling insects which flower is ready to be pollinated. And the flowers will often start that reddish purple color and then they turn blue. Now, the second big reason that plants use color is for seed dispersal. As with pollination, plants can't stand up and walk around. They're rooted to the spot in most cases. That means if they want to move, they need to get an animal to come and help them do it. And that's what's happening here with these bright red fruits. This plant has a whole bunch of seeds, and it doesn't want those seeds to fall down under the tree. If they fall down under the tree and they germinate there, the baby trees will have to compete with their parent tree for water and light. What this tree wants is for those seeds to be dispersed a long distance away. And the best way that it can do that is to get a bird to come along. And birds, of course, are very attracted to red. And so these berries are bright red. And in the right time of the year, you would see clusters of robins or waxwings feeding on these berries and then flying away into the distance and pooping out the seeds at some distance away from the parent. So in this case, the plant is using color not to attract pollinators, but to attract seed dispersers. And red is an extremely popular color for fruits, mainly because it attracts birds, and birds are probably one of the most effective seed dispersers because they have the ability to fly, which means they're likely to take the seeds a good long distance away from the parent. The other really common color for fruits, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is black, or that kind of bluish black, anything from blueberry color right through to purple plum color. Both of those colors seem to be very popular with birds. This is a cherry laurel here, and the fruits of this plant always get consumed by birds. Now, as we mentioned earlier with monkeys, the fruits change color depending on their readiness to be distributed. Most plants will produce fruits that start off green, and gradually they will change into a brighter color, often yellow or orange or red. And it's only when they've reached that bright color that they are ready to be dispersed. And that means they are ripe. And generally a fruit that's ripe is softer and sweeter, and the seeds are ready to go. A fruit that is not ripe is green, and it's hard, and it's bitter or astringent in some fashion. Now, curiously, this plant, this is a viburnum, has a particularly interesting color story together with its fruits. So if you look at those fruits there, you'll see some of them are red and some of them are black. Both of them are ripe. What viburnum fruits do is they start off green, and then they turn red, and then they turn black. But when you look at these viburnum fruits closely, you'll find that chemically they're slightly different in the two different stages. When they are red, they tend to be very rich in sugars. And when they are black, they tend to be very rich in lipids. That's the building block of fats. Why do they do that? Well, that viburnum is trying to maximize its seed dispersal. And the red fruits that are full of sugar, they tend to be consumed by birds that live locally, birds that need a quick high energy boost. Whereas the black fruits tend to be consumed by migratory birds, birds that need a longer lasting punch of energy in order to feed them. This means then that the viburnum is covering both bases. Its fruits will be eaten and its seed dispersed by birds locally within its local area. But if they're also being fed on by migratory birds, then those seeds might also go on a much longer journey. So this plant is cunningly increasing the range of its seeds by producing two different kinds of fruit on the same plant. Now, last but not least, another way in which plants use color is in defense. And this is an area of study that's still quite new. But one of the things you may be very familiar with is that many plants, particularly a lot of evergreens, when they produce their new leaves in spring, they are bright red. This is a persea, so it's a relative of avocado. But many other trees produce these bright red leaves. A good example being the purus or lily of the valley tree. Its new leaves are bright red. And the bright red color is there to advertise to animals that these leaves are not pleasant to eat. What the plant is trying to do is to prevent its soft, delicate, tender new growth from being eaten. And it's not the only one. Here we have an oak tree doing exactly the same thing. The new growth is red and probably rich in chemicals that will make the foliage unpalatable. The plant is warning animals that the foliage is unpalatable by changing its color. And it's not the only plant to do so. Check out this cactus. This is from the southwest, and look at the color of those spines. Those spines are bright red, which means that a variety of animals will spot them easily and won't become impaled. This rose too is doing the same thing. Look at the color of those thorns. Again, it's a warning. Don't come close to me. I'm dangerous. And one of my last stories on this page, this is a very curious looking plant. So I was hiking up in the mountains here in Washington State, and I spotted this plant from a long distance away. And from a distance, it looked a bit to me like lemon thyme. Now, why would lemon thyme be growing out in the wild, remote mountains of Washington State? Well, of course, it was not. When I got closer to it, I realized what I was seeing. So this is a native member of the cabbage family, which normally would have green leaves, but it's been infected by a fungus. And if you look closely at it, you might see on some of those leaves little ball-like structures. Those are the fungal spores. When this fungus infects the plant, it converts the plant into looking flower-like. The fungus is able to actually modify the DNA of the plant and get it to express a yellowish color. We call these fake flowers or pseudo flowers. Insects are attracted to this bright yellow. They think it's a flower. And when they fly in and look at it and try and find the pollen or try and find the nectar, they get the spores of the fungus on their bodies. Then when they fly to another plant, they drop off those fungal spores. So this plant, in this case, it's a fungus, is pretending it's acting like a flower, being colorful in order to attract a pollinator who will then distribute its spores. And a number of different fungi produce these fake or pseudo flowers as a way of ensnaring bees and other insects who will then distribute the spores of the fungus and allow them to infect another plant. Pretty far out. But how do plants produce color? We talked about how color really was how light was reflected from the plant. And the way in which light is reflected is largely determined by the pigments that are in the plant. Now, this kind of strange looking picture is a close-up image of what the inside of a leaf looks like. And if you imagine the top of the picture would be the upper side of the leaf and the bottom of the picture would be the lower side of the leaf. In the middle, you'll see all of these cells, which are called mesophyll. And these cells all have little green structures in them called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts contain most of the pigment in a leaf, and they have a really important job. They're there to do photosynthesis. And of course, I'm sure most of you know that photosynthesis is the chemical reaction whereby plants take carbon dioxide and water and combine it using energy from the sun to produce oxygen and sugar. And it's that sugar that the plants feed on. So photosynthesis is the thing that allows plants to live. And in fact, it's the process that allows all life on this earth because it produces the food that we eat and it produces the oxygen that we breathe. And the reaction requires a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the catalyst that allows this reaction to take place. And so the green pigment that you see in leaves is caused by chlorophylls. But plants also have a couple of other distinct pigment groups in their leaves. Carotenoids, which tend to be yellow or orange, and anthocyanins, which tend to be red, purple, or blue. Now, what about fall color? We're all familiar, particularly at this time of the year, with how leaves change color in the autumn. Here are two plants at Heronswood showing particularly good fall color. On the left, we have a lindera, and linderas produce a blinding display of yellow, and that color comes from carotenoids. So carotenoids get their name from carotene, which was the original carotenoid that was ever found. And of course, it was extracted from carrots. And it's the thing that causes the orange color in carrots. It's also the orange color in pumpkin. It's in a wide variety of different plants, and it's a yellow or orange color. In the fall, as temperatures begin to drop and as the days get shorter, the plant begins to cut off its leaves. It builds a little layer of cells that will allow the leaf to abscise or to fall off. During that process, less water and nutrients reach the leaf, and the chlorophyll, the green pigment, starts to diminish. When it disappears, it reveals those pigments that were already in the leaf, but that you couldn't see because of all the green. So in essence, these yellow colors you see were always there. They were just covered up by all that green. And once the green disappears, you then see the lovely yellow. And if you see yellow or orange, then it will be the result of carotenoids that are revealed once the yellow disappears. Reds and purples, on the other hand, they are the result of anthocyanins. And anthocyanins give red and purple color in a lot of plants. If you eat blueberries, then the bluish color comes from anthocyanins. And anthocyanins are not in the leaf all year round. They tend to be produced in the fall. And the process of their production involves light. And so if we have a really, really sunny late summer and early fall, you will tend to get more reddish and purplish color in leaves than if we have a really cloudy or dark late summer. So the reddish color can vary from year to year. This is a fothergilla, which is a relative of the witch hazels. You can see it has a really lovely reddish color. We don't get the same kind of colors you guys get over on the East Coast. Washington is the evergreen state, and we really aren't good on deciduous plants. And so we plant as many as we can at Heronswood to try and extend our season of color. Now, several factors influence the color you see in fall color. And that's important if you're ever trying to plant for a fall color. You know, if you buy a plant for its floral color, you're pretty much guaranteed to get what you buy. If you go to a nursery and you buy a rose that has red flowers, it'll always have red flowers. But if you go to a nursery and buy a shrub like this witch hazel because it has beautiful fall color, you take it home and plant it, it may not have beautiful fall color. And that's because fall color is influenced by several different factors, and you really need to have the right combination in order to get a good display. Now, genetics is part of it. If you ever walk around a forest of, say, red maple, you'll see some of the maples have better color than others. And that's because genetically they are predisposed to have better fall color. Day length also influences fall color. The weather does, and stress too. If a plant is very stressed, it will often produce a better display of fall color. Soil pH can also influence it. So the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, you'll generally find that plants growing on an acidic soil produce a better display of fall color. So that explains why fall color will sometimes vary and that you'll get good years and less good years. Well, what about garden varieties? There are lots of plants that we grow in the garden that have unusually colored leaves. And the two commonest colors you'll see in the garden are gold or purple. And gold plants with gold leaves often have the name aurea associated with them. Aurea is the Latin for gold. Whereas those with purple leaves will often have the word atropurpurea, dark purple. And the intensity of those colors varies depending on how much light they get. In fact, you'll find with gold leaf plants, you have to kind of position them in the right place. If you put them in too much sun, they will scorch. And that's because they don't have that much pigment in them. The reason why they're gold is because they have less green in them. And because they have less green, they have less protection from UV light, which means they're much more likely to scorch. Equally, if you grow a gold leaf plant in full shade, it'll turn green. That's because in the dark, the plant needs to produce more green chlorophyll in order to survive. So with a gold leaf plant, you really need to position it in the right spot where it's getting enough light, but not too much. Purple is the reverse. So purple-leaved plants are a result of anthocyanins, and the brighter the light is, the darker the color will be. If you grow them in full sun, you'll get the best display of purple leaves. If you grow them in the shade, you'll get kind of a greeny purpley mix that's not as pleasing. So any purple leaf plant, whether that's a smoke bush or a viburnum or a nine bark like this one, the more sun you give it, the darker the purple color will be. Another variant on the colorful leaf is variegation. Now, variegation is where you get more than one color on a leaf, and usually it's either green and white or green and gold. With the ones that are green and white, those white areas have no pigment in them whatsoever. In the green and gold, the gold sections have yellow pigment in them, but no green. In this particular shrub, this is Stachyurus magpie, the plants start off green and gold, but as they mature, they eventually become white and green. And one of the things you'll notice about plants that are variegated is that they don't grow as vigorously as all green plants. And that's because they have less chlorophyll in them. And chlorophyll is the pigment that allows them to produce food. So variegated plants are always weaker than plain green plants. The other thing you have to watch out for in variegated plants is reversion. So that's when the plant starts producing all green stems. If that happens, you need to prune them out because those all green foliage stems will grow much more vigorously than the variegated ones because they have all that extra pigment, and they will eventually outgrow the plant and all you'll have is a green plant. Now notice on this plant that we have green in the center of the leaf and white on the outer edges. This one's the reverse. You have green on the outer edges and you have gold in the middle. And variegated plants vary in the degree of variegation. They also vary in how that variegation shows up. In this case, we have good gold striping, but in other plants, you'll see gold or white patches or spots, or even some striping. Now, plants produce flower color in very much the same way that they produce leaf color. It's all down to the chemicals that I've already talked about. And the blues and purples and violets, they tend to be anthocyanins. Green gives you green is caused by chlorophyll, so green leaves or even green flowers like the zinnia. Yellows and oranges and into the reds tend to be carotenoids. But there's also a fourth group of compounds called betalains. And betalains are only found in a certain group of plants. And the name betalain comes from the word beta, which is the Latin name for beets. And of course, what color are beets? They're a purple color. And that purple color in beets that dyes your skin if you get it on there, that's caused by betalains. So the group of plants that are related to beets all have betalains instead of the regular red pigments. But these four different groups of pigments are responsible for all of the colors that you see in flowers. When you look at what pollinates these flowers, you'll find that different groups of animals have different preferences for flower color. Here we have a hummingbird, and generally hummingbirds prefer the red end of the spectrum. So orange and red flowers and maybe pushing into purple and pink. That's what you'll find them on most often. Bees, they tend to like yellow and into the blue area. And so those flowers that are yellow tend to be very strongly attractive to bees. Butterflies tend to be more towards the purple end of the spectrum, but they'll also feed on yellow flowers too. And the other two big groups of pollinators that I haven't mentioned here, bats and moths, well, they really like white flowers. And white flowers are flowers that don't have any pigmentation in them. And the reason that those animals like that color is because those animals come out at night. Moths and bats are both largely nocturnal, and at night, you can't see color. So there's no point in a plant that's pollinated by a bat or a moth having a colorful flower because the moth or the bat won't be able to see it. But a white flower really stands out in the dark. And so that's the color of a bat or a moth pollinated flower. And you can't see them here because they're not in the color spectrum. Now, some plants can actually change the color of their flowers. It's not a very common habit, but it's very well known in hydrangeas. And as I'm sure most of you know, the reason for changing of color in a hydrangea is to do with soil pH. In the flowers of hydrangea are pigments. The best known one is called myrtillin. And myrtlein has a strange relationship with the element aluminum. Myrtlein can bind to aluminum. And when it binds to aluminum, it changes color. What's that got to do with soil pH? Well, aluminum is in the soil, but plants can only absorb that aluminum if the aluminum is dissolved. If the aluminum is dissolved in the soil water, then plants can suck it up. If the aluminum is a crystal, then plants can't suck it up. And on an acidic soil, aluminum tends to dissolve, and that means that plants can suck it up. So on an acidic soil, plants absorb aluminum, it binds with the myrtlein, and the flowers are blue. On an alkaline soil, the aluminum is crystalline. The plants can't absorb it, and so it doesn't bind with the myrtlein, and the flowers are pink. In a white hydrangea flower, there's no pigment, no myrtlein whatsoever, and so the flower just stays white. And so soil pH influences the color of our hydrangeas. And it's not all hydrangeas. Actually, most hydrangeas have white flowers. It just so happens that two of the most common hydrangeas, Hydrangea macrophylla and Hydrangea serrata, both have flowers that have different colors depending on soil pH. And sometimes the plants can get confused. So here in Heronswood, we are on an acidic soil, and so our hydrangeas are generally blue. But check this one out. When I first viewed this plant at Heronswood, it had entirely blue flowers. But then last year when I photographed it in bloom, it was entirely pink. And then look at this one. This plant here has some very blue flowers. Look at the one at bottom right. But it also has some that are almost fully pink, like the one on the left. And it has some that are somewhere in between, kind of a reddy purpley color. Why might this be? Well, probably somebody playing around with some lime. It's not uncommon in places with an acidic soil for gardeners to apply lime to the soil. Lime is alkaline, and applying it to the soil adds nutrients, and it can also make nutrients more readily available for plants in the soil. But it also messes around with the soil pH, and that messes around with the color of our hydrangeas. So that's probably what's gone on here. Now, we've talked about the basic color of a flower and that attracts insects or other pollinators, but why would plants then have patterned flowers? And we have a whole array of different patterns here. We have a gentian top left that has stripes leading down into its tube. We have a pelargonium where the upper two petals are very brightly patterned. Next to that, we have a salvia, a sage, that has a very large white marking on its lower lip. Likewise, the orchid, Coleogene, has a brown markings on its lip, whereas geranium here, it has black lines that point into the center. And lastly, Peony, another orchid, you can see it has a really brightly colored lip. These patterns are here to tell insects how to visit these flowers. Why would they care? Well, from a physical perspective, these flowers can only be pollinated if the animal lands on them in the correct place. So for example, the geranium, all lines point to the middle because that's where the sexual parts of the flower are. And so the geranium is guiding the insect into the middle to where it needs to go to be pollinated. In the case of the salvia or the orchids, those big lips, that's where the insect needs to land. And if the insect lands in that location correctly, it will find the nectar. So the pattern is there to tell the insect where it needs to go. In the case of the gentian, it has this long trumpet, and the nectar is right down there at the bottom. What these patterns do is they help the insect know where to probe into the flower in order to reach the nectar. And in the case of smaller insects, where they need to climb down. And if you look at these flowers under ultraviolet light, and a lot of insects can see ultraviolet light, whereas we cannot, the patterns are often even more enhanced. So the patterns that you see are not as bright as they are to an insect when it's viewing these flowers. Now, I mentioned earlier that another way in which plants use color is to encourage animals to come and feed on their fruits. And I also mentioned that red and black fruits are the most common. And that is true if you look all across the Northern Hemisphere. The most common color for a fleshy fruit is either red or black. Why is that? Flowers come in a million different colors. And I thought I would find a few different fruits that weren't those colors. So we have snowberry, which is a Pacific Northwest native with white fruits. We have Sorbus pallescens, which is an Asian mountain ash with pink fruits. We have beautyberry, which is famous for its purple fruits. We have a yellow fruited form of your Eastern native holly. We have Lonicera pileata. It's a little honeysuckle shrub which has strangely translucent fruits. And then we have Ophiopogon, a mondo grass that has very vivid bright blue fruits. But these are very much the exceptions. Red and black, by all measures, are the most common colors in fruits in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's all to do with the number of visitations. A flower has to be visited more than once. With a flower, what you want is for an insect to come in and pick up your pollen and then go away. And then another insect needs to come back and bring pollen and revisit the flower. That doesn't work, though, if that insect comes to your flower, picks up your pollen, and then goes to a completely different species next and drops off the pollen there. So what plants have tried to do is they've tried to make their flowers unique. They've tried to make them so distinctive to look at that the insects that come and visit know which flowers they're going to. And ideally, what they want is that one particular insect specializes in visiting just that flower. Because if the insect only visits that one kind of flower, then that means it's going to take the pollen to the right place. So in terms of plant flower colors, it's worth them being lots of different colors. And there's a vast variety of different colors in flowers. Evolution encourages flowers to be lots of different colors because it leads to specialization of pollinator. And the pollinator then is much more likely to visit the right flower. But that's not the case with fruits. A fruit only needs to be visited once. The bird comes, it eats it, and then it flies away. Well, in that case, you don't want to have a specialist animal feeding on your fruits. Ideally, what you want is to have lots of animals feeding on your fruits, because the more animals that feed on your fruits, the more likely your seeds are to get transported far away. In which case, the best option is to just use one or two commonly known colors. That way, a lot of different animals will understand the message that they are being given. And that's why plants primarily do red and black fruits. That message is understood by hundreds of different bird and mammal varieties, which means that those fruits get dispersed. Now, when you go into the tropics, you don't find this. If you go and look at tropical fruits, you'll find they're in a whole range of different colors. So this black and red fruit story really only seems to apply to the far northern hemisphere, but it shows that plants are subtly using color to manage the behavior of the animals around them. I kind of like the idea that I've always liked the idea that plants manage us rather than us managing them. And certainly you can see that in the way that plants use color. Now, most of the color we've looked at so far has been as a result of pigments, but colors in plants aren't always produced by pigments. And here are 3 examples of colors that are produced through other methods, in this case, physical methods. So on the left, we have a succulent plant, which is covered in wax. In the middle, we have a everlasting flower where the leaves are covered in hairs. And on the right, we have an air plant, which is covered in scales. And all 3 of these look silvery to our eye, but it's not due to there being some kind of silver pigment. There's no pigment in there whatsoever. If you cut this plant and dry it, it will remain the same color because there's no pigment in there to break down. All of these plants are utilizing different structures to develop their color. And actually, one of the reasons that they do that is because all of these plants grow in places where they may get drought stressed. They all grow in bright, sunny locations. And having silvery leaves has a number of advantages. A silvery leaf will reflect some sunlight, which helps to cool a plant down. A waxy or hairy or scaly surface is also a good way of holding in moisture. So plants lose moisture through their leaves, through pores in their leaves. But if they're covered in wax or hairs or scales, then that's going to reduce the amount of moisture they lose. Lastly, being hairy, waxy, or scaly also means that animals are much less likely to eat your foliage. So having these structures on leaves is a really big advantage to the plant. And when you see a plant that has silver leaves, 9 times out of 10, it'll be a plant that needs a hot, dry location. So this silvery color is not only useful for the plants, but it's also useful for us gardeners. It tells us something about where these plants need to grow. Now, another kind of coloration is this weird metallic coloration. So you can see here we have a begonia, a selaginella or club moss, and then this very strange fruit, Polea condensata. All of them have a slightly outlandish, out of this world blue color to them. This blue color has only recently been understood by scientists. We now realize what is going on here. This isn't so much of a physical structure, it's more physics. Within the leaves of these plants, all of which grow in dark, shady places, the plant has developed a method of maximizing the amount of light that it can grab in those dark locations. So when light hits the surface of these plants, it bounces inside the surface of the leaf. And when it bounces, it reflects off a little bit of blue light. That's because blue is at the long end of the wavelength spectrum. So these plants are producing this bluish glow through an intricate system of reflection. And it isn't to do with pigment. There's no pigment involved here. And the interesting part of that is these berries here, if you collect them and you pickle them or do anything to them, they continue to have this very metallic color to them. And that's because if you pickle a fruit, the pigments in that fruit will be released. And so the fruit never looks quite the same color after it's been pickled. But you pickle these fruits, they look just the same, metallic, shiny blue. And that's because the color that is being produced here is not being produced by a pigment. It's being produced physically. And it's thought that this metallic blue color for this berry makes it really easy for birds to see in the darkness of the woods. And you may actually see this on a couple of plants that you're familiar with. There are a couple of different viburnums that have fruits that are metallic like this. And it's thought that this kind of bluish glow helps the birds to see them. Now, all of the kind of science I've been talking about and the science of color is great, but how does it help you as a gardener? Well, there's a few ways it's really useful. Firstly, gardening for wildlife. The choice of color, whether it's in a flower or in a fruit, will really determine the kinds of visitors that you get into your garden. Having a wide range of flower colors means you'll get a wide range of visiting insects. Having berries of the right color will mean you'll get birds and other animals to come and visit your garden. Color can also give you a few hints about where a plant grows. So we just talked about silvery leaf plants needing sun and dry soil. That's because they tend to grow, they tend to inhabit arid environments. The color of a plant might also determine where you position it. So we spoke earlier about how gold leaf plants need to be grown in a spot where they get some sun, but not too much. They're prone to burning, but if you grow them in the shade, they turn green. So if you've got a gold leaf plant or a variegated plant or a purple leaf plant, then you need to know where to position it in your garden so that it gets the right amount of light. It's also worth considering the colors of plants if you're looking to have a colorful garden throughout the year. So don't just consider flowers, think about spring foliage color. Many plants flush brightly in the spring. Think about foliage color in the fall. Think about bark and stem color. Think about autumn fruit color. And if you think about all those different types of color and sources of color, then you'll have a garden that is colorful throughout the season. And people generally like my photos here, so I always like to tell people what they are of, just in case you're looking to grow it yourself. So the red is an abutilon or flowering maple. The orange is an English marigold. And if you're growing any English marigold, get the variety neon. It just is absolutely dazzling with those lovely black tips. The yellow comes from a cactus. This is a Pointia fragilis potato, which is a native North American cactus species, a little dwarf one suitable for growing in a rock garden or container. The zinnia is envy, as in green with envy. I love green flowers. They're one of my addictions, and I particularly like this one. Bachelor's buttons, a variety called Jubilee Gem, is the blue, and really there's nothing more blue than bachelor's buttons. A lot of plants that you buy that are blue are actually purple, but this one really is a true blue. Now, indigo was kind of the hardest color for me to find, and the nearest I could get was this Fritillaria persica. This is an Asian fritillary bulb, a little bit of a tricky one to grow, but it does have a very unusual flower color. And lastly, Gladiolus purple prince. Well, there's a lot of really great purples. My grandmother used to always dress in the most lurid purple shades, and so whenever I see a flower like this, it always reminds me of her. What about gardening with color? Well, we're not here to talk about design, but there are a few kind of basic principles that you should keep in mind when gardening. And one is that white is right at night. White really stands out in dark locations. So whether that's in a nighttime garden or whether that's in the darkness of the woodland, try and grow a lot of plants with white flowers. All of these things really stand out in a dark environment. Now, this time of the year, we leave home and it's dark. We get home and it's dark. It's nice to have a few things in the garden that are white because they really shine up. But we also, here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of our gardens are covered with huge, big coniferous trees. And so again, having white flowers really helps us to light up our garden during the dark days with that dark canopy overhead. Daytime is for drama, and bright colors really do shine at their best during the day. Color tends to become more washed out at night, and that's when you really want to think about pastels. So pastel colors tend to be regular primary or secondary colors mixed with white. And if you want to bring a little bit more color into your evening garden, then pastels are a good way to go because they have that element of being bright like white and easier to see, but they still have a bit more color. They also tend to feel soft. So if you're looking for a garden that is not too visually stimulating, then pastels are a good way to go. Some people like their gardens to be really loud. Other people like them to be soothing and calming. And you'll often find a lot of pastel flowered plants are grown in places like hospital gardens. Green is neutral, which is a good job, really, because pretty much every plant is green at some point, even if the flowers are brightly colored. Green pretty much also goes with anything. I like to spot green flowers throughout my gardens. My favorite is the tobacco plant, Nicotiana alata, also Nicotiana langsdorffii. They're both excellent green flowered tobaccos that just work wonders in amongst other things. I really like hot colors, so a lot of my borders are full of reds, oranges, and yellows, but these greens really work very well with them, being both zingy and calming at the same time. And here are a few of my favorites. So that's me got to the end. I see there are some questions there for me. So would you guys like to read them out, or shall I read through them myself?
Please go ahead and read through them.
Okay.
If you can see that and feel comfortable
Yeah.
with that.
Okay, so Kathy says, what about black flowers? Do any pollinators visit them? Well, one of the things that's interesting about a black flower is there are very few that are actually truly black. Most of them are really a dark violet color. But yes, insects do pollinate them. Plants don't develop colors that don't work. If the color doesn't attract an insect, then the plant won't get pollinated, which means it won't reproduce, which means it won't pass on its genes to future generations. Generally, the handful of plants that do have black flowers have probably evolved them as a specialist relationship with a particular insect that is particularly able to see that color. So it may well be that the insect that pollinates them has a particular sensitivity to that kind of dark color. The one exception would be black flowers bred by people. I'm particularly fond of a black flowered petunia. But actually, my daughter likes to grind up the flowers and make a pigment with them. And it makes actually a kind of a bluish purple pigment rather than black. When plants are bred like that by people, then they don't necessarily have a pollinator that will come and visit them because they haven't evolved with a pollinator. But if you have a plant that has truly black flowers that has evolved that way, Iris chrysogramphis is a good example. There's a salvia, it's salvia discolor, has black flowers. There will be an insect somewhere that likes that, but you may not find that regular insects in your own garden will visit it.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just looking at my black as midnight violas, and they are definitely not a naturally occurring black flower. Yeah,
but they're gorgeous. Another one I like is Molly Sanderson, really great black with a little yellow center. They look great. They're not going to provide much for insects, but you know, not everything in the garden has to be food for insects. Olivia asks, what controls fruit color in the southern hemisphere? Why would it be different than the northern hemisphere? Well, there isn't as big of a pattern in fruit color in the Southern Hemisphere, but it's worth mentioning that there isn't so much going on in the Southern Hemisphere. If you look at the land masses, the vast majority of our land is in the north. So Northern Hemisphere is all of North America, Europe, and most of Asia. Whereas in the Southern Hemisphere, you're just talking about a part of Africa, Australia, and a part of South America, outside of the tropical zones. And so those areas don't necessarily all connect with one another, and nor do they necessarily have the same animal species. Up in the Northern Hemisphere, we have very similar birds and animals across the north. You can find the same species in North America, in Asia, and Europe, and all of those species are related to each other and therefore recognize those set colors. But because South America, the tip of Africa, and Australia are so isolated from one another, they don't have all the same related animals, and those animals may not recognize the same colors. And so you don't find the same degree of pattern in the color of fruits down there. You'll see a lot more variation. Okay, Olivia also asked, sadly, deer do not seem sensitive to the plant color warning. Well, that's true. What I find is that deer are very sensitive to how expensive the plant is, and the more expensive it is, the more they want to eat it. Deer are land mammals. They have bichromatic vision, so they don't have the same kind of color vision that we do. Their vision is more muted, and so it's harder for them to see they don't see the range of colors that we see, and so they probably don't see the warning signs that we see very clearly, just because their vision isn't as acute in terms of color. They have very good vision. That's what stops them from being eaten. They just don't have the same kind of color vision that we do. And so a bright red, for example, wouldn't be nearly as bright for a deer. Okay, I think I got all the questions. Is there anyone who'd like to ask any questions verbally? I'm happy to take them.
Unmute. Yeah, I have a question, and I'm sorry I didn't get it in the chat fast enough. But I grew up in New England, and we have these wonderful sugar maples, and on one tree in the fall, you can have so many different colors on the leaves. It seems to me that that's one of the trees in terms of its fall color that has the most variety of changing colors on one tree. Why is that?
So the reason that the leaves change color is that the plant is getting ready to shed them for the winter. And the reason that plants shed their leaves for a winter is actually multiple fold. One is that leaves hold on to snow, and that means extra weight during a snowstorm might break the plant. So it's worth getting rid of those leaves so that the plants don't get damaged by snow or by wind. And obviously leaves act like a sail on a tree and cause it to blow over. Secondly, during the winter, animals get pretty desperate for food, and so they're much more likely to browse a plant more heavily. And so getting rid of your leaves helps to prevent you from dealing with that issue. And that goes for insects too. There are insects that would be feeding on them. But also, photosynthesis is not very effective during the winter. We don't have as much light. It's a lot colder. Leaves are also subject to being frozen. So there's a lot of good reasons why a plant might choose to get rid of their leaves. But to get rid of their leaves, they have to form what's called an abscission layer. And an abscission layer is a layer of corky cells that develop in the stalk of the leaf. And once they develop fully, they cut the leaf off. They break those little tubes that connect the leaf to the main plant and through which water passes. Once that layer is fully formed, the leaf will fall off. But as that layer is forming, slowly it blocks off the access to water and nutrients from the tree. As those water and nutrients become less available, the green color starts to diminish. The plants can't produce more chlorophyll without those water and nutrients. And that's what starts to reveal the yellow colors. But it doesn't all happen at exactly the same time. Different branches, it's happening at a different rate, which at least in part explains why some parts of the tree might be more green and some parts might be more yellow. But then there's the red, and red is caused slightly differently. Red is not caused by a pigment that's already in the leaf. Reds and purples develop in the fall. And as that layer is forming in the stalk of the leaf, the chemistry that's going on in that leaf changes. What the plant does actually is it sucks up all the potassium, and without potassium, the chemistry changes, and you start to get the development of these purple and red pigments. And the process is heavily influenced by sunlight. The more sunlight you get, the more purple and red you get. So that's the reason you get variation in the degree of purple and red. It depends on how much light those leaves are getting. And you'll often find that the ones that are more out and further out at the tips, they're more exposed to the sunlight. So they get more sunlight on the leaves, which means the chemistry means you get more of the red and purple. So there's different factors going on there. We had a tree here at Heronswood where one of the branches turned the most beautiful red and purple, and the rest of the plant was still green. So it's difficult to know why one random branch might start doing autumn color when all the rest of the tree was still perfectly green. So there's still some things going on in there that we don't necessarily understand. But because of the nature of the chemistry that's going on there, it varies depending on the position on the plant, which is why you can get a tree that's has a coat of many colors.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was a bit long-winded.
No, that was, thank you. That was terrific.
Hi, Ross. I'd like to know a little bit more about the pigment your daughter makes from those dark petunias and whether other petunias offer up their color in a similar way. I'm also real curious about dyes, since some flowers work and many don't.
So the black petunias, if you crush up the flowers and mix them with water, you get a purplish color. If you then use that purple color and paint onto, say, a piece of paper, which is what she does, she'll write her name, say, that name will then change color as the paper dries, and it eventually turns kind of a pale blue. So this seems to be a pigment that is influenced by once the pigment is extracted, once it's exposed to the air and to oxygen, it starts to change color. And there are a few pigments that do that have a chemical reaction once exposed to the atmosphere. Human beings have been using dyes extracted from plants for millennia. You can get almost any color that you wish out of plants, but the chemistry of it is a little more complex in terms of using mordants to fix colors to fabrics. And some pigments are light sensitive, and so if they are exposed to the lights, they break down, and so you lose the color. But you probably have more expertise than I do on that particular area of it. But in the end, it's just a way in which human beings have exploited the colors that the plants produced purely for other purposes, for pollination, for seed dispersal, or whatever. Humans have found ways of exploiting those colors to make their clothes. But it's interesting that the only reason we see color, and therefore, I mean, if we didn't see color, then we wouldn't have colorful clothes. Why would there be any point? The only reason we see color is because we evolved to see the color of fruits and fruits changing color. So plants effectively made us have color vision, and we've used that color vision to cut down plants and crush them and take the color out of them to make our clothes colorful. So it's an interesting little bit of philosophy there about how plants have influenced us, and then we've taken that and run with it and used it to make the most of color in plants. But of course, I like to think about gardens too. If it wasn't for color, gardening would be a pretty sterile occupation.
Thanks. Yeah, it would.
Let me see, are there any?
I don't think there are any more in the chat.
Okay.
But I will note that Adelana asks a wonderful question, given that you can see her beautiful loom behind her, and that she does actually shear sheep, dye the wool, do all the things that get it to clothe to weaving. I don't have that right, Lana, but whatever those intermediary steps are.
It's at the top of my mind because they just took a magical workshop getting almost a full spectrum out of the indigo that I grow. I'm used to blue, but we got purple, yellow, green, taupe, lovely colors. Red is still a little tricky, but we got a great orange. So dye is a wonderful thing to play with, and the chemistry is it's just so wide-ranging and remarkable. I feel often like a witch at the end of a workshop like that. So thank you but I've not heard about making pigments from petunias, so that'll be fun. Thanks for the tip.
You're welcome. And it's natural fibers are an issue that are particularly important to us here at Heronswood. Heronswood is owned and operated by the Port Gamble Scullum tribe. We're the only botanical garden that's owned by a native tribe. And they were one of a handful of tribes in the Puget Sound area who historically wove using the wool of dogs. They had special woolly dogs that were bred purely for their fur. They were kept separately from other, they weren't pets, they weren't food, they were kept just for their wool. And unfortunately, those breeds are now gone. And our weavers here at the tribe are trying to find substitutes for that dog fur. But if you look at old textiles made by them that you'll find in museums here in Washington, they've looked at them and sure enough, they are made from dog fur.
Do they still have examples of that fabric? Can you see the fiber?
You can see the fabrics in a variety of different local museums, but unfortunately the dog breeds themselves are gone. Pictures of them make them look a little bit like a Pyrenees. You know what a Pyrenees dog looks like. And there's occasionally talk about trying to rebreed or recreate this variety, but
that's what I wondered. I've enjoyed spinning. There are many dogs that have a secondary coat, and the softer undercoat is quite spinnable. I have a sweater made out of husky fur, so I wish them good luck. I'd love to see that dog come back.
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
I really appreciate your talk tonight. There are many congratulations in the chat. So thank you so much for a very informative talk. We really appreciate it.
I hope you all have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much. You too.
Okay.